Evaluate the integral by using integration by parts. In this case here, we're looking at a definite integral, and we have the integral going from 0 to pi t times the sine of 3t. So the first thing we're going to do is identify what we're going to let u equal. In this problem, we're going to let u equal t, and therefore dv is going to equal the sine of 3t dt. Okay, now in step 2, we're going to go ahead and then take the derivative of both sides with respect to t. So du is going to equal dt. And then we got to find the antiderivative of the sine of 3t dt. Well, the antiderivative, we know that the antiderivative of sine is negative cosine. And so this is going to give us negative 1/3 times the cosine of 3t. Now again, let's just go ahead and review that to remember how to do that. So if we wanted to take the antiderivative of the sine of 3t dt, we'd let u equal 3t. du is going to equal 3 dt. Divide both sides by 3. And then we end up getting the sine of u times 1/3 du. So we would have 1/3 times the sine of u du. And then the antiderivative of the sine is negative cosine of u, which would be negative 1/3 times the cosine of 3t plus c. So that's how we're getting that. Now in step number 3, let's go ahead and rewrite our question. So we're going from 0 to pi of t sine of 3t. And then we're going to use our formula. Since it's a definite integral, we have u times v going from a to b minus the integral going from a to b v du. So we know that u is t, and we know that v is negative 1/3 times the cosine of 3t. And we're going from 0 to pi minus the integral going from 0 to pi. We know that v is negative 1/3 times the cosine of 3t times du, which is dt. Okay, so let's go ahead and then put in our, or at least simplify here. So we have negative 1/3 t times the cosine of 3t going from 0 to pi. We're going to factor out the constant, so a negative times a negative is going to give us a positive 1/3 going from 0 to pi cosine of 3t dt. Okay, so similarly, if we want to take the antiderivative of, in this case, the cosine of 3t, well, it's going to be similar to what we just did. So we know that u is 3t. We know that du, 1/3 du is going to equal dt. So if we did our substitution, we would have the cosine of u times 1/3 du. And then we would factor out the 1/3. And then the antiderivative of the cosine of u is going to be the sine of u. And so that becomes 1/3 times the sine of 3t. So over here, let's go ahead and complete that. So we have negative 1/3 t times the cosine of 3t going from 0 to pi plus 1/3 times the sine of 1/3 times the sine of 3t going from 0 to pi. Okay, so now let's just factor out our constant. So we're going to have negative 1/3, and then we're going to evaluate t times the cosine of 3t going from 0 to pi. If we factor out the 1/3 here, 1/3 times 1/3 is 1/9. And then we're going to evaluate the sine of 3t going from 0 to pi. So we have negative 1/3. And if we evaluate pi, this is going to be pi times the cosine of 3 pi minus 0 times the cosine of 3 times 0, which is 0, plus 1/9. And then evaluating at 0 to pi, so we're going to have the sine of 3 pi minus the sine of 0. Okay, so now let's go ahead and evaluate. So we have negative 1/3. Okay, and we have pi times the cosine of 3 pi so the cosine of 3 pi is negative 1 times pi is negative pi. And then that's minus 0. Because 0 times 1 is going to give us 0. And then plus we have 1/9. Okay, and the sine of 3 pi, or the sine of pi, is going to give us 0 minus the sine of 0, which is 0. So we have negative 1/3 times negative pi, which is going to be pi over 3. And this is going to give us 0. So the answer is going to be pi over 3.